Good afternoon, Henya. How are you today?
Good, Grace. How about you?
I'm feeling fairly, a little nostalgic. we're returning to my hometown of Perth in Western Australia to review today's case, which is the murder of one brothel Madam Shirley Finn, which happened in either late on the 22nd or early on the 23rd of June in 1975. Yeah, it's another one of the colourful local pieces of folk history, and it has been revisited every couple of decades when there's been a new inquest, or when one of the investigators, the police or politicians involved passes away, and perhaps some of the people related to them come forward, either alleging deathbed confessions, or now that perhaps a bit of a threat or a promise that was made to keep silent about certain things has passed with the passing of the person. New information comes to light, and there's a new inquest that has gone on every a couple of times. So it's definitely on the forefront of a lot of people's consciousness, and it reaches zeitgeist every now and again. So we thought we would revisit the murder of Shirley Finn.
The more I was getting in the investigation and the different leads in that story, it just get more and more twisted. And I started hearing some names that you mentioned to me before, especially people of the Western Australia Police and people of the organized crime, which was quite impressive in an ironic way of being impressive. The level of police corruption in this case, and many others.
There's one thing that I think a lot of Australian underworld figures have in common all through Australia, whether it's Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Brisbane, is that historically, back in what they referred to as the bad old days, there was a lot of intermingling of the underworld with its larger-than-life colourful figures and the police force, and also the legal fraternity, and also, obviously, business, but definitely politicians. There are numerous accounts, as we will hear particularly in this case, of fairly high-ranking politicians, usually state representatives, who have fairly close social ties and some fairly close personal ties with a lot of these figures. That being said, there was some fairly compelling evidence, and there's definitely a lot of testimony saying how close Shirley was to a lot of Perth's and West Australia's elite. There we go.
So may I that would be
introduce.
Yeah.
Cover the bases of this particular event.
So our protagonist in this story was Shirley June Finn, whom was born on the 2nd of November of 1941 in Fremantle, on Western Australia. So Shirley was the eldest child of a bomber pilot, and during her early childhood, she had to be raised by her mother. After the war, the family lived in the suburb of Mount Pleasant, and she lived a fairly good life. Before we continue, I would like to say one of the main sources that we used for this episode, and it's the book Dirty Girl by the author Juliet Wills, an Australian journalist that not only did a biography of Shirley Finn, but the book is also an investigation on the crime, and later on we will see how important Juliet Wills was for this cause. So Juliet did a research about the whole life of Shirley Finn. And she really points out a pivotal moment in her childhood, that is when she was 13, 14 years old, and Shirley Finn was starting puberty. Juliet Wills will say that she started having issues with her family because apparently there were older boys that were trying to date a very young Shirley Finn. Particularly, Wills says that Shirley Finn's mother said that one day Shirley told her that she had lost, quote-unquote, her virginity to a 20-something-year-old boy, Tim, that took her to a bar, and that she told her mother that experience had been awful and that she felt like she didn't win anything with that encounter. The family were worried about her going out with these boys, not only because they were older, but also because of what the morality and the ideology was at the time about girls. A girl should remain virgin until
she gets married and has a family and all that sort of stuff. It should also be said that that her family, the Shearings, were quite devout Catholics as well.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure they didn't have any sort of sex ed at that time, so the issue of Shirley having sexual relationships, which they were really abused because of the difference of ages between she and these other boys. But a teenage pregnancy, was a reason for a family to be very, how do you say, shunned?
Shunned, ostracized by society, and particularly the devout Catholic society.
So it seems that after this first encounter that Shirley had, their parents were able to give her a curfew and actually get her to follow their advice. It doesn't seem like they were a bad family. They were just really concerned about her well-being, but she was very extroverted, and she wanted to go out, as some teenagers really enjoy. So it was just a month after she had seen this boy, Tim, that she went out with another guy, a 20-year-old guy called Pete. And that night, Shirley Finn didn't go back to her parents' house, which resulted in her parents calling the police to look out for her. And indeed, she was found in this guy Pete's house, and this is something that I feel it's so sad, and it must have been traumatizing for Shirley. She was taken to the magistrate, to a judge, at that time, and she was ordered to spend 8 months in.
It's like a Catholic workhouse, basically, like a kind of like a boarding school, or a welfare home, basically.
Yeah, a Catholic church welfare home, and I feel it's so unfair and infuriating because this guy, Pete, who was obviously doing something illegal, seducing or even having sex with this 14-year-old, he never got any punishment for that. Juliet Wills puts a lot of stress in this event because it turned out to be a pivotal point in her life in Shirley Finn's house. So she was sent to the Good Shepherd, this Catholic welfare home, which was notoriously cruel. In that place, the girls, the interns, would be they were doing basically forced labor. They had
from accounts, it's mainly laundry service.
A laundry service. Yeah. And the welfare home was actually making profit. They weren't doing that for free. So they were having these teenage girls spending long shifts doing cleaning for hospital and hotels, and they wouldn't get anything. And Juliet Wills says that the meaning behind this punishment, because it was really a punishment for a teenage girl's sexual behavior, was to cleanse their souls. And that's why Juliette Wills says that she named her book Dirty Girl, not because she thinks that Shirley was a dirty girl, but because that was the idea and the impression that got
ingrained
in her mind. And there is actually psychologist report done before and after Shirley Finn spent the time at the Good Shepherd. And it really shows that before going there, she was an extroverted and very energetic and vivacious young girl. And after that, she had a feeling of loneliness and shame and also even depression. So it was a particularly traumatic event. And in an ABC News documentary that we watched together, there's this childhood friend of Shirley named Helen, whom says that Shirley actually claimed that she was molested by the police before she was taken. I mean, that she was molested the night that the police were sent to look for her, the night she escaped, let's say. And also, I have to note that, Shirley's family didn't want her to go to the welfare home. They disagree with the
judge's decision,
with the judges, because they were really doing that out of interest for her safety, not as a punishment for being a dirty girl. So that's really sad, really.
Yeah. I mean, as we said before, in their own kind of way, they did want what was best for Shirley, but I think their idea of that was very rooted in the time, and in a very polite, not overly keeping up appearances type aspect of respectability, but they just wanted to try and produce what they thought was a good human. Unfortunately, at this point, it was a good female who would become a young woman who would probably get married, have a family, and
be a housewife. Probably.
Which, at the time was the social norm.
Exactly. So after Shirley left the home, the Catholic welfare home, at 15 years old, she left and... Okay. So after leaving the welfare home, which she attempted to escape a couple of times as well, Shirley didn't went back to school, probably because she must have been very ashamed of all that process. And like we were saying before, of the ostracism of a person by society. So she started working retail, and that's when she met her husband to be Desmond Finn, who was a 22-year-old Air Force mechanic. So she married a pilot, like her father. I find that very curious. They married in Perth, and then they went to live to Melbourne, where Desmond continued to work in the Air Force, and Shirley worked as a sales assistant at Buckley and Nunn. In the next 3 years, Shirley Finn would give birth to her 3 children, her sons Stephen and Shane, and her youngest daughter Bridget, whom I think until nowadays is the only one of her children that is alive.
And Bridget has been fairly, I think, active in trying to get to the bottom of her mother's murder, and has been quite active in investigating and talking to various investigative journalists that she that she trusted, and I believe she's still in contact with quite a lot of her mum's old acquaintances and friends. So she's still flying the flag, so to speak.
Yeah. So according to Juliette Wills, even though Shirley was they were very much in love with Desmond, and they had like a honeymoon phase at the beginning of their marriage. Desmond soon started to show signs of being an aggressive man. I mean, I think basically all of the romantic relationships that Shirley Finn had were actually quite abusive.
Yep.
So, apart of being naturally a dominant person, Desmond suffered from a head injury when Shirley Finn was approximately 21 years old. And not only he became depressed, but also he was incapacitated to work. And at that point, remember that they already had 3 children. So Shirley started to look for another option, another, how can I say, marketplace?
Another means of generating income. Shirley basically had to become the breadwinner, and support her husband, who was suffering mentally.
But I think she was also looking forward splitting that relationship at some point.
I think because it had such a big downturn, particularly after the accident, and there was, for someone who had dropped out of education at a fairly young age, essentially the age of 14.
15.
15? That's true, but before that she was
she was
Catholic
exactly, and she
workhouse.
Wasn't studying there.
Yeah.
So she turned into sex work, and it looks like there was quite a boom at those times, also because of what business?
Mainly because of the
mining.
Oh, of course.
Of course.
Of course. Australia was seeing another mining boom as Japan and, predominantly Japan, but was requiring a lot of raw resources to use in its ramped up production. Of course, with the extra, the growth in the mining industry, you get a lot of miners going away on their couple of weeks swing and then coming back with a pocket full of cash and burning a hole in their pocket, and
I'm looking for take the edge off. So to speak.
And it's sex work and mining in Australia has always gone hand in hand from the the very early days of the first gold rushes. And, it's just history repeating itself even up until this day in Australia. But definitely at the time, the sex industry certainly was having itself a boom. And also, due to the era, which, I think was definitely sort of in the swinging 60s.
Yeah.
There was a lot more sort of sexual expression happening. And one form of this was body painting,
and striptease. Which were the first jobs that Shirley started to take. She also worked traveling with a
boxing tent. That's the one.
Say that.
Yeah. No, but also a boxing tent was kind of like a travelling sideshow. It wasn't just the boxing ring where you'd have the tent champion who people could come and challenge for a certain amount, for a few dollars. And then if they won, then they would, aside from, getting the bragging rights, they would win a small jackpot as well. Needless to say, the tent champions were some very, very, very hard men, and it wasn't very often that they were beaten by members of the public. But that being said, some of the side attractions were tents where people could see a striptease, or in Shelley's case, body painting, which she was.
I think it's very curious how it looked like it was a normal thing to have that type of side jobs, especially when we have to remember that at that time prostitution was pretty much illegal in whole Australia. Actually, even though she was doing good with her business, in 1969, Shirley Finn was conducting a body painting and escort business that was actually raided by the police. And she was charged and convicted with, well, of course, keeping premises for the purpose of prostitution. And this resulted in a second period of ostracism, but
by society
Shirley
at large. Essentially,
for Shirley, but now it also added her 3 children that at that time were going to a Catholic school, and they had to leave the premises.
That's it. I mean, I'm sure people would have whispered quietly if they knew, because Perth still, but even especially back then, was, a very big country town, as they say, or not so much that, perhaps a bit unfair, but was, definitely everyone knows everyone, and something like that being a secret would be nigh on impossible. But I think with such
with a conviction,
it was well and truly out in the open and completely undeniable now. So unfortunately, that's when society clapped back, and that's when she had the unfortunate ostracism from her society. Her kids were kicked out of their school, which was a Catholic school, and they effectively got pushed deeper into the margins, so to speak.
Yeah. But Shirley didn't give up about working in the sex business for this occasion. And this is when it starts getting complicated, because shortly after she had been arrested and convicted, she became associated with a woman called Rotia Flatman, who was a brothel operator whom used to work in Sydney, especially in the King Street, which is basically...
King's Cross.
King's Cross, which is the street with all the brothels. And it was this woman, Dorothea, whom introduced Shirley Finn to the system of the...
How to be a brothel, madam, basically.
Of the Policy of Containment.
Yes.
So what was the Policy of Containment?
Well, effectively, it was working hand in hand with the vice squad of your particular area. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the police and politics or politicians and the judiciary, as well as organised crime, all had understandings which were usually in the form of kickbacks, or lubricated in the form of kickbacks, whether they were time with some of the sex workers on the side and being invited to fairly exclusive gentlemen's parties, or whether they were financial kickbacks.
Cash.
Yep, cold, hard cash.
Cash.
Lots and lots of cash.
Bribes.
So the area of containment was essentially an agreement brokered by, in this particular case, very notorious sex work kingpin, criminal by the name of Abe Saffron.
This is not the last time that we're
No.
that we're going to talk about
So
Abe.
yes, that's right. This isn't the last time we hear about Abe Saffron. So he was able to broker a bit of an agreement with the West Australian head of Vice Department, of the Vice Squad,
Bernie Johnson.
So in this case, it was up to the Vice Squad to regulate and hence contain the brothels that operated in Perth at the time.
That is, Shirley Finn would meet up weekly with Bernie Johnson, and she would give personally the money that she was owing the police as protection, quote unquote. And there are several witnesses of this relationship, to be precise, such as, well, in the ABC News documentary that we also mentioned before, Helen, this childhood, livelihood friend of Shirley Finn actually recalls the day when Shirley told her that she was working as a brothel madam, and Helen tells her, you cannot do that, you know that's illegal. And Shirley Finn answered, I know, but I work with the police and I pay a lot of money to be in this business.
Mm-hmm. She also sort of recounts the method of payment, which, you know, really is something out of a movie, where she would have to meet Bernie Johnson in a car park, almost a vacant lot, and Bernie would drive his car right up next to Shirley's, and she would hand off the bag of money, and then he would drive away, and basically passing it through the windows. Yeah, and that was the method of transfer. So yeah, very very cloak and dagger.
Yeah,
well,
exactly. So under the containment system, quote unquote, Shirley Finn made a lot of money for a few years. She happened to buy a very luxurious house at the south of Perth, and I actually found a news article that indicated that even Elton John went to a party once there.
Yep. Well, she was well known as throwing some of the best parties that Perth was. She was well known for throwing some of the best, most extravagant, fun parties that were going on in Perth at the time. It was a veritable who's who list or personalities, as.
And when you see the pictures of Shirley Johnson, you can really tell that she's like Shirley Finn. Of Shirley Finn, you can really tell that she's showing off the wealth that she was enjoying for a while. So she was living in this very nice house with a very nice pool, by the way, with her younger daughter and with her partner, whom was a woman called Rosalind Black or Rose Black. She was doing all right for a couple of years. Yeah. But even though she was making a lot of money under the containment system, at the same time, by 1975, Shirley had
accrued a fairly large tax bill, which unfortunately she hadn't been keeping up with her taxes, and
over $150,000. So
so fairly large, still fairly large now, but back then that was an absolute fortune, and she was completely unable to pay it. And you might be able to bribe the West Australian police force, but...
I mean, she would have been able if she had sold her mansion.
That's right. She could have, but the last thing she wanted to do was that was, that was her castle. That was her sort of sticking her middle finger up to the rest of society, saying, "Guess what? You ostracized me. You threw me on the heap, and look where I am now. I'm looking down at you."
And she had a family.
And
looks like she had a very loving relationship with this woman, with Rose Black. To her murder, Shirley had arranged a tax hearing for, that $150,000 that she was owing to the tax department. Shirley was supposed to attend a tax hearing on the week after her murder, actually. And there are several witnesses that can tell that she had been threatened to certain personalities of the Western police to blow the whistle if they didn't help her. So one of those witnesses is a woman called Lee Wiswick, whom speaks in the ABC News documentary, and she indicates that she used to be the driver of Shirley Finn and also a sex worker in one of her brothels. According to Lee, not only Shirley had a relationship with Rosalind, but she also had an affair with Ray O'Connor, whom was...
At the time, he was the police minister of Western Australia, And later he would go on to become the Premier of West Australia.
Exactly. So Leek indicates that she would drive off Shirley to have meetings, or more like dates, with Ray O'Connor, and that around the time of her crime, she eavesdropped a conversation in which Shirley told to Ray O'Connor, "If I go down, you go down too." And there's also an acquaintance of Shirley called Jacqueline that she received. She had a visit of Shirley one day in her house. Shirley Finn told her about another meeting with a different agent of the police force called Owen Leach. Shirley had said, allegedly, according to Jacqueline, that Owen told her to shut her mouth, and also told her that on the night of the 22nd of June, she would have a meeting with someone important who would help her. Shirley said that Owen indicated her, or told her to get dressed to impress. The nickname of this man that she was going to meet this night was allegedly the Bear. And we actually know someone who was nicknamed the Bear, but we're going to tell that afterwards.
Yeah.
So Bridget, Shirley's youngest daughter, tells that the night of the 22nd of June, they made a barbecue at her house with Rose at 6 p.m. And that then, at approximately 8 p.m., Shirley told Bridget that she should have an early night, so she basically sent her off to bed. And at 9:40, one of the neighbors of Shirley testified that she saw her leaving her house in her white Dodge Phoenix. Shirley Finn's body was found by a
motorcycle patrolman.
At 8:30 on the morning, at 8:30 a.m. of the 23rd of July of 1975.
Yeah.
Her body was found inside her Dodge Phoenix, which was parked in the golf club of Perth, in South Perth.
The Royal Perth Golf Club in South Perth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Her body was over the driving wheel. She was wearing a ball gown, and all her money and jewelry were with her, which included some pretty expensive
I was going to say, there were some
diamonds.
fairly extravagant and, it's fairly impressive jewellery she was wearing. It's worth looking up.
Which at least indicates that she wasn't murdered for her jewelry and her money, at least. And she had been shot 4 times in her head. The police would later say that this was an execution-style murder. The journalist Terry Willesee was one of the first ones to arrive to the crime scene. Basically an hour after the body was found, he got to the place. In an interview given in 2019, Terry says that he didn't notice at that time, but the crime scene was covered with cops and journalists walking around all around the place, touching stuff without using gloves. And he had actually peeked inside the car where the body of Shirley was still there. He also says, and there is video footage of this, that when the police took the body of Shirley out and they took the car away from the golf club, they didn't took it with
a tow truck, or they didn't load it onto the back of a flatbed truck to, sort of preserve the car in its original state. There is literally a police detective jumping in the front seat where Shirley had been murdered, and then just casually reversing it, and then, peeling off down the road, driving it back to the police station.
He put a white sheet on the seat, but yet that's not the procedure of how to take a car.
No.
And Terry, this journalist, also says that he noticed that in any moment the police opened the trunk of the car to check if there was anything back there.
So from pretty much the get-go, it's acknowledged that the crime scene was completely contaminated. The whole investigation was pretty much botched right from the get-go, and that there was little to no forensic integrity maintained whatsoever. The fact that police and journalists and bystanders were just tromping around, going for sneak peeks in the car and everywhere around.
In less than a year, the police surrender and the
verdict.
The verdict or the investigation files to the coroner, which deemed the crime as an unsolved case, even though there were a couple of leads that they weren't followed. The case of Shirley Finn went kind of forgotten for a couple of years because it was very, very much covered by the media by many years, but
it just hit brick walls. There was just nothing. Even a lot of the people involved with Shirley's life were effectively silenced, or had the threat of violence hanging over them. So a lot of them were well and truly keeping their mouths shut. And obviously a lot of the other...
and so many leads were ignored until the 2000s. That is around the time when Juliette Wills started doing her own digging up in the story of the crime and the life of Shirley.
And also by that stage, the police force in Australia in general, but definitely in Perth, had gone through somewhat of a cleansing. A lot of the old guard, some of them were still working there, but by that stage there'd been a few other controversies that had angered the public, and of course by this stage people were a little bit less naive when it came to corruption and the inapproachableness of the honour and integrity of the police force and politicians and judiciary. So they'd been through and cleaned up a lot of the police force, and a lot of the old guard had retired by this stage, or sort of had retirement thrust upon them. So the police force was still known to close ranks, as we'll see. However, it was by no means the threat of violence wasn't as implicit as it would have been in the 70s when this murder occurred.
Yeah. So one witness that Juliette contacted after, like in the modern times, like nowadays, was a man called John Mearns, whom told her, and he later on testified, that he had actually been past the Royal Golf Course on 6 a.m. of that morning, the morning of the 23rd of June. And he testifies that he saw Shirley's white Dodge. It was a very flashy and very attractive car also, so it was easy to spot. And one green car that was parked next to Shirley's car, and two other cars that weren't the police. None of them are police cars, but anyhow, that they were parked outside. This man, John Mearns, actually contacted police at that time, at the time of the murder of Shirley. But he was he called the police to give his witness, and he got communicated to a sergeant, which said that he appreciated the information, but they that they already had enough information about that case, and they never took a formal witness. So they completely buried that one. Wills also had an interview with Ray O'Connor and Bernie Johnson, which are both on the ABC News. Do you want to say something about that?
I don't remember, to be honest.
Okay.
I'll let you do it.
So Ray O'Connor, which, let's remember, was the minister...
or the police minister.
Of the police and an alleged lover of Shirley Finn. He was interviewed by Juliet, and he denied even knowing Shirley in the first place.
Yep.
But there's a witness of an ex-police cop called Colin Rowe, whom, in the day of the murder of Shirley, went to the police force to her house to look for evidence or leads, and he actually found and he peeked into a photo album in the house of Shirley Finn, and Colin Rowe found several pictures of a pool party in which he could see and recognize very well the face of Ray O'Connor with Shirley Finn and other police agents. So this photo album was taken by the police, but guess what happened with that, Chris?
Oh, I couldn't imagine all this vital evidence.
It vanished.
Oh.
It vanished. It was never found.
Just think today it's probably sitting in a drawer somewhere in you know, Police Central in the CBD of Perth.
She also interviewed the ex-chief of the Vice Squad, Bernie Johnson, whom was the cop that Shirley was paying personally the money for belonging in the containment system. And Wills asked Bernie Johnson what went through his head when he got to the crime scene and saw the body of Shirley Finn. And Bernie Johnson answered, not the same that went through her head. So he cracked a joke about this woman that had been shot 4 times in the head. He denies, of course, getting money from Shirley, getting sexual services from her brothels, because that was also part
of the
deal, as you said. Very well. One of the new witnesses that were willing to talk nowadays with Juliet Wills was also Rose Black, Shirley Finn's at that time partner. She would tell Wills that she witnessed a reunion between Shirley Finn and Bernie Johnson in her own house, and that she helped Shirley hid some money in a
shoebox or a hat box.
And she also mentioned that Shirley Finn would call Bernie Johnson by a nickname, which was the Bear.
The Bear.
And she knew that Shirley was going to have a meeting on the night of the 22nd of June. And Rosalind told Shirley that she would offer to hide in the trunk of the car to save her as a protection. And Shirley told her not to do that because she was going to be hiding the money that she was taking to the reunion in the
trunk. So
in the trunk.
That would give her away straight away the second the trunk was popped.
Do you know how much money she was paying per week to Bernie Johnson and the Western Police?
No, how much was that? Was it $100?
In the ABC News documentary,
Yep.
we hear a former brothel madam called Linda Watson, whom knew Shirley, whom also was another witness in the inquiry, the nowadays inquiry. And she would say that Bernie Johnson asked her to pay $100 a week per girl.
Per girl.
That had in her brothel. And then once a time after the crime for Shirley happened, Bernie Johnson was actually threatening this madam, Linda Watson. He needed her help because he was looking forward burying or messing around with an honest cop
Oh, yeah, he was trying to set up a honeypot.
That's how you call it.
That's how I believe it's called. Yep. So he needed to catch this, get
some dirt
get
on
some
this
dirt.
guy.
Needed to generate some dirt on this honest cop.
And that he threatened this madam, Linda Watson, and told her that if she didn't help him, she would lose her business and she would end up like Shirley Finn.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's outrageous how easily they were going around threatening people. Like, yeah, you see these people, we totally kill her. And no one can touch us. It's outrageous. So it's in 2017 that Juliet Wills publishes the book Dear Digger. And on that same year, Willis, with Bridget, Finn's daughter, they finally managed to force the police to run a coronial inquest, which is basically a new investigation to open the case, the files.
And this one, rather than being handled by the police force, is handled by the coroner's office, which is related to, but not completely at arm's length from the police force, but has enough independence that it can not be directly interfered with procedurally by the police.
So Benny Johnson was called as a witness, naturally, in 2017, but he didn't went because, according to his doctor, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer and dementia, and he wasn't fit
as a witness.
And on April of 2018, Bernie Johnson died at age 80 years old. There's a bit of more of speculation of who else could have done it, even though it pretty much seemed that was the same Bernie the Bear Johnson. There were many other leads, such as this known hitman, criminal, apparently very famous in Australia, Neddy Smith. What can you tell me of Neddy?
Well, it was known that he had flown to Perth for allegedly an arranged meeting with Shirley and with an unnamed police officer. This much was known, and that was a bit of information was given by a former WA detective, James Boland, or James Archibald Boland. It was considered hearsay, or it was a rumour at the time, but it was believed firm enough that it was actually documented and, if needed to, could be investigated and verified further.
There's nowadays another testimony of a former police cop, which we couldn't find the name of the witness, probably because it's because of their own protection, that had witnessed seeing Shirley Finn a couple of days before her murder, and she was in the canteen of the police department, actually, having a meeting with other agents. This unknown cop, gave this testimony at the time, and a couple of days after that, he was another motorbike. How do you call it?
A motorbike patrolman.
A motorbike patrolman. He was actually hit in his motorcycle by a car full of detectives. Or, well, he claimed that there seemed detectives for him, and that they literally told him to shut his mouth, otherwise he would end up dead.
And it should also be said that it was also former police officer James Boland who, as well as making people aware at the 2017 hearing about Neddy Smith, that It was also one of the reasons why the information about Neddy Smith was being delivered to the officer, James Boland, was that the Alan Lewis, who was the one providing information on a semi-official level, wished for the police to have some fraud charges that his boyfriend was having brought up on him at the time. He wanted those charges to be downgraded. Now, with this information that Boland took and was having added to the files, he was approached by the Criminal Investigation Bureau, or the CIB boss, Don Hancock. Any other people who know anything about West Australian policing and crime would know him as a very prominent figure and, again, a very crooked character. And he told Boland to drop it and to not have any further involvement in the inquiry. So
there you go, with this John Hancock that was actually murdered in a car bombing several years later.
That's right, suspected to have been placed by bikies over decades of rivalry and involvement with each other. I think it finally caught up with him.
But he was also involved in the investigation for the robbery of 49 gold bars.
Yes, the infamous Perth Mint swindle, which is possibly something we might cover on a future date. But Don Hancock, interesting character.
This policeman couldn't lay straight, not even in bed.
No, he couldn't.
That's how crooked they are.
Yes.
And we had another witness that recognized Bernie Johnson somehow. A man called Philip Hopper, that at the time of the inquest was 68 years old.
Mm-hmm.
He had been close to the Royal Golf.
The Royal Perth Golf Club.
Royal Perth Golf Club. Exactly. He had been there with a girlfriend or some girlfriends or some friends or whatever, just spending the night, and he heard a couple of gunshots. Mm-hmm. Afterwards, he was approached by two men, and they told the pair to keep quiet or that they would be shot.
Mm-hmm. And he alleges that of those people intimidating him, one was Lawrence Tudori, who was a nightclub owner in Perth, and later was also intimidated by Bruce Wilson, who was a former leader of the Australian Workers' Union. So, as you can see, the ties into,
but there was a
spider
third
web.
Man. Yeah.
There was a second man, but subsequently,
and in an article in ABC News, he pretty much says that he had spent the last 40-something years being afraid of telling his story and what he said. So we have plenty of evidence. It's almost reminds me kind of the last case, but not quite, because in our last case we didn't have any names. Well, not that we know really. And here we have a few, but there is one that keeps coming back, and that is Bernie Johnson. But what was the result of the inquest? Actually, the inquest finished on August 2020. What did the coroner Barry King said?
Findings. So, once the inquest was closed, that there had been utter incompetence in the investigation done by the police, and that there were far too many suspects, and that a lot of the vital evidence had completely disappeared, including the murder weapon, which I don't think they had any idea.
They said that it was a rifle.
A rifle, but there's a lot of rifles.
There's
a lot
of rifles.
types of rifles.
And there was another hint, but an unknown person that claimed to have been a lover of Bernie Johnson.
Yes.
A woman that I couldn't find the name precisely.
Well, I think, was that witness L?
Oh, yeah. witness L,
Yes.
that claimed that in a bedtime confession, Bernie Johnson told her that he had murdered Shirley Finn utilizing a shotgun, and that he had buried that shotgun in a country house that he had, and that he had also some gold hidden there.
Yeah.
Allegedly, this woman tried to search up for that for a while, but, well, that's...
Didn't have any luck finding it.
Yeah.
No. That might have been the Gidgegannup house. Where,
Yeah.
Yes, which just outside of Perth, and a beautiful, beautiful area.
You know the house?
I don't know the house. I know Gidgegannup. Gidgegannup's beautiful. I used to have to go through Gidgegannup on the way back to the family farm from Perth if we needed to go there for anything.
You know the scene of the crime scene.
I do. Well, I do know.
Have you ever...
Everyone's driven. Anyone who's on the Mitchell Freeway or the Kwinana Freeway, heading south from the centre of the city past Como, which was where Shirley Finn's luxurious mansion still resides today, will pass the Royal Perth Golf Club in South Perth. It's right across from the zoo, and you can drive past where the car was found, and give your respects to Shirley.
But we are rambling. So what did the coroner Barry King say again?
So effectively, he said that the case was inconclusive because of a lack of evidence which had been bungled beyond comprehension, that there were just too many suspects, that it was hard to narrow down to sort of focus what little evidence there was and what evidence there was, and that there was quite a lot of testimony. And while a lot of it was solid, a lot of it was contradictory or called other parts of other pieces of the testimony into slight,
Not to mention that one of the main suspects died very recently.
Well, that is true. That is true.
And
so regardless...
Tragic. I mean, the case, it's not... close either.
No.
It's weird, maybe because I don't understand the judicial system, but the detectives of the Western Police, according to Coroner Barry King, they must follow any new leads that they might get.
Yeah.
So...
well, it was ruled inconclusive. Yeah. So it just means there wasn't enough evidence to make an official binding resolution and finding.
I mean, in the last interview that I read from Bridget, she doesn't seem optimistic. It's more like what she says is that she feels that her family has been denied justice, that her mother, Shirley, was a good mother. She cared for them. She mattered to her. And she felt like she had been abused and used her whole life, and her death is just the tip of the iceberg. She feels a bit of satisfaction after all she's done with the help of Juliette Wills. So at some point she feels a partial, it's not a full closure because the justice didn't do anything.
No.
But her only consolation is that they did the best they could
with what they had, and that it's back in the public consciousness again, and that definitely isn't being swept under the rug. Perhaps, as I said, enough time has gone by that a lot of the actors involved, some of the more violent actors, have passed away, and no one's around to cover their threats or to back up their threats anymore, or no one cares about them enough or is afraid of them enough to protect them. So certain pieces of information that people were too scared to come out with were revealed at this particular inquest.
What is the status of sex work in Australia nowadays, Chris?
Well, depending on which state you're in, it's largely legalised in different forms. Some places allow you to be registered, like in I think it's Victoria. Sex workers can be registered, and off the back of that, obviously, becomes protected, so that if they are assaulted, that they can actually approach police now and get some form of recognition and have their crime
and not being
investigated.
chased like criminals.
Exactly, and that they're not going to get stood over because they're paying the government tax, not obviously paying protection money to the police now to exist.
I mean, there are some states like New South Wales in which brothels are also legal, but a brothel must be registered, whereas in Western Australia it's only autonomous sex work that can be done, but a sex worker can publicize and can be open about the status of their work. I mean, I'm sure that there is a lot of stigma around that, but it's not the same as being a sex worker, having the stigma and being chased by the police or having to pay bribes like we see, because what the Western police was doing with Shirley and the other madams was just asking for bribes.
Effectively.
You could have
They were just running a racket, essentially.
Yeah, you could have your business if you had the means to pay for the police, because there were other people that couldn't pay or that they weren't picked by the Western Australian police, and those people were getting raided and arrested by the cops.
Yes, they're essentially, being forced out of business.
Just to say that sex work is work.
Sex work is real work.
I reckon that if she had had the possibility of being an autonomous sex worker or have autonomous brothels and not pay for the police, perhaps this story would have been very much different.
I think absolutely it would have been different. Hopefully she would have been able to approach a reputable accountant and get her taxes under control rather than having to funnel the money through various companies and aliases and what have you to try and obscure the fact that she was running a quasi-semi-legal, mostly illegal brothel. And she would have been in the position to have to rely on these despicable men. So
these very crooked policemen.
These absolutely crooked as hell policemen. No.
I mean, to me, it's important to point out this stuff because in Argentina, the legal position towards sex work is that it's an abolitionist country. Therefore, sex workers are being chased. There are there's many people that do sex work and autonomous sex work, but there are many sex workers that work in the streets. And actually, they have to take care of the police and not of the clients themselves. It's like, I think it's important to point out that being an unregistered worker carrying with the stigma doesn't help a person. And even though it's very common in the true crime world to see criminals that they seek out for sex workers as victims, they don't do it because sex work itself is dangerous. I mean, they are in a vulnerable position because of a stigma, or because of the police chasing them as criminals, or having to pay bribes to the police to perform their work. And even in this case, Shirley Finn was paying a lot of cash to be in the business, and she ended up with 4 bullets in her head.
Yes.
And her children were left, motherless. Richard was 13 years old when she knew of the death of her mother.
Well, that's where we shall step off from the case of the unsolved murder of Shirley Finn, and I'd like to remind you to feel free to visit us on any of our social media. If you just search for a history of bad men, history of evil men.
A history of
evil men. And just look up History of Evil Men on YouTube, on Instagram,
Twitter, Facebook, and we also have a Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like sparing some dimes.
A few dollars. And yeah, we look forward to bringing you the next installment of our little podcast. And thank you again for listening. And we shall leave you on the outro with the enormously, infinitely talented Steph Animal. Goodbye and stay safe.